Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Kristen Radke, discussing her latest book, Seek You, A Journey Through American Loneliness, in conversation with NINA MACLAUGHLIN. Tonight's event is part of our ongoing virtual event series. As we remain digital for the time being, we're so excited to continue the work of bringing authors and their writing to our community during these difficult times. Especially now, it is through the support of authors and our beloved readers that we are able to make events like this continue to happen. So thank you so much for showing up for us week after week. For tonight's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask the speaker something, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display, where you can submit all of your questions. We will get through as many as time allows. If you go to the chat section, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your own copy of Seek You. If you already have a copy of the book or would like to contribute to this series and our store in a different way, I will also be posting in the chat a link to our website's donation function. We greatly appreciate any and all support you are able to extend to us at this time. Please note that closed captioning is available for this broadcast. Depending on which version of Zoom you are using, you may need to enable it yourself. Simply locate the button marked Live Transcript on your display and click through all the options. And one final note, as you have probably experienced during virtual gatherings this past year, technical issues might come up. If any glitches do occur, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your patience and your understanding. And now it is my sincere pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Kristen Radke is the author of the graphic nonfiction book Imagine Wanting Only This, named a Best Book of 2017 by Forbes, LitHub, and Electric Literature. The recipient of a 2019 Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant, Radke is the art director and deputy publisher of The Believer. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Marie Claire, The Atlantic, The Guardian, Vogue, and in many other publications. Tonight, she is joined in conversation by NINA MACLAUGHLIN, author of the acclaimed books Hammerhead, The Making of a Carpenter, Wake, Siren, Ovid Resung, and Summer Solstice, an essay. After working for 9 years as a carpenter, she is now a books columnist for the Boston Globe, and her work has appeared in many publications, including the Paris Review Daily, The Believer, American Short Fiction, and elsewhere. This evening, they'll be discussing Kristen's latest book, Seek You, A Journey Through American Loneliness, a stirring and blood-close plumbing of the depths of loneliness, both individual and societal. The Publisher's Weekly calls a marvelous deep dive into that universal emotion, blending science, memoir, journalism, research, philosophy, and pop culture to explore isolation and our desire to be close to one another. Drawing upon a rich and luminous history, exploring such developments as the introduction of the laugh track and the infamous experiments conducted by American psychiatrist Harry Harlow, Radke constructs moments that are as tender as they are sublime, moments generated by our maddening need to both connect and, when we can't help it, to look away. This past year has confounded all of our notions of loneliness. Even the word itself seems ill-equipped to carry such a profoundly isolating experience. We are fortunate, however, to have Kristen Radke's work, this timely and timeless artifact, to give us the language for this uncharted period of longing. We are so very excited to be hosting this event tonight. Without further ado, I'm now delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is all yours, Kristen and NINA.
Excellent. Benjamin, thank you so much. And thank you to Harvard Bookstore. I am extremely excited to be here with Kristen tonight to talk about Seek You, which has really been sort of exploding my mind in a lot of different ways. And we're going to start, Kristen's going to read and show some of the book to us, and then we'll sort of get into a conversation about the project.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Harvard Bookstore and Benjamin. I love Harvard Bookstore. I had hoped to be with y'all in person, but global pandemics, blah, blah, blah. So here we are. But I can't wait to get back and see y'all. It's been a couple of years since I've been there, and it's just such a beautiful, welcoming space. So I'm glad to be with y'all virtually. And NINA, who I've admired her work for forever. It feels like forever now. It's just so, every time she writes a book, I'm just so thrilled to see what she does next. So I really appreciate you making the time to chat with me tonight. I'm going to do a super short reading from the beginning of my book, and then we'll move on to the conversation. Actually, I just have to adjust a couple of things on the screen so I can see what I'm reading. Okay. In amateur radio, operators call out across frequencies with a series of punctuated monotone beeps known as a CQ call. When pronounced in French, the official language for international telecommunications, CQ sounds like the first two syllables of sécurité, used to mean pay attention. Over time, English speakers took it to stand for seek you. A CQ call is a reaching outward, an attempt to make a connection across a wavelength with someone you've never met. It means essentially, is there anyone out there? And invites anyone listening to answer. In Morse code, it looks like this. If the caller is lucky, another user will hear and latch on, reporting their handle and location. These calls are broadcast across low frequencies, which bend with ease across the curvature of the earth, allowing for contact across thousands of miles. Callers may speak into a handheld receiver, but Morse code takes less power and cuts through noisier stations, pushing audible messages atop the static. It's customary to send written confirmation of this interaction using a QSL card, typically about the size of a postcard. This is an exchange merely of record, not an invitation to continue the conversation. The postcards function like participation trophies. They're evidence that contact between yourself and another person has taken place. Evidence in a way that you exist. Others have verified it. One night years ago, when I was in my early 20s, I was up late visiting my uncle. With a bottle of bourbon I brought him on the table between us, he began telling me about my father. He was obsessed with ham radio, my uncle said. I'd never heard of ham radio, but apparently my dad stayed up every night making CQ calls. He'd crawl under the roof to fix the antenna he'd salvaged from a nearby dump, scavenging for another after a winter storm snapped the aluminum at its brittle center. His first receiver, a secondhand model from the 50s, built with metal vacuum tubes in a pre-transistor era, weighed 100 pounds. They grew up in a family of 5 boys in an economically decrepit part of rural Wisconsin. Their father drank, their parents divorced, and they spoke of their late mother with reverence to her sainthood the way that many men talk about their dead mothers. During my own childhood, my father had the demeanor of fathers I'd read about in the historical novels I hoarded in my room, stoic, religious, extraordinarily strict. I was terrified to leave food on my plate or hear his footsteps slow on the carpeted hallway outside my bedroom door, fearing he might open it and see the mess inside. There was no bigger crime to him than waste, or not respecting the things we had. My uncle's story was the first time I had access to my dad's need for anything other than order. I'd seen no evidence of desire beyond it. I'd never thought that he'd have looked for, of all things, connection. What does a CQ call sound like? My uncle poured another glass of bourbon and held his hand in the air, replicating the beeps exactly, his finger pulsing to accentuate each one. How can you remember that? I heard it constantly, every night, over and over. In order to operate ham radio, you needed to get a license, my uncle said, and pass the Morse code test. Then you were assigned a handle. What was my dad's handle? WD9JHQ. My father started his own family a few towns over from where he was raised, a still rural, slowly developing subdivision, where I was filled with a basic sense of unbelonging that many children are prone to feeling. Beyond geographic remoteness and the impassable expanse between myself and what seemed like everyone else, I was raised with the tenets of Midwestern politeness. Be quiet, don't touch. When I was grown, I moved to New York, where I was met with my childhood's opposite, the inescapability of other people. Living in a city can become a practice in containing the hostility we feel for the strangers we live alongside. Annoyance when a man's leg is pressed up against ours in a packed subway car, tempering our rage-filled glances at someone vocal frying to their friend or playing tinny music from a cell phone. The days are loud and long, and on some exhausted evenings, the simple existence of others feels like an inconvenience. Strangers invade the monasteries of our minds. Congestions puts those we don't know and will likely never speak to on brief and shifting stages, like department store windows about to be redressed at the end of a season. A girl slumped to her side on the subway, asleep on her way back from school. A man's face illuminated by his laptop's glow through a ground floor window as he sits alone in his apartment. A woman leaning into a post as she holds her cell phone tightly to her ear in an empty parking lot. I didn't expect the ease with which I'd come to project loneliness onto these moments, apply an Edward Hopper glaze over the crystalline banality of a stranger's routine. When I walk down a street at night and catch the corner of a bedroom beyond a window's curtain, or see a woman fumbling for her keys on her apartment front stoop, I'm surprised by the longing I feel for the people I pass and the homes I'll never be invited into, or perhaps more accurately, for the lives I'll never live. How quickly, then, my annoyance at the proximity of other people turns into tenderness. The grating of a subway car coming down the tracks, its sharp staccato screeching, becomes not the sound of aging infrastructure, but a chorus of solitary voices, like searching CQ calls. The more I've watched Companion with Strangers, the more I've come to think that these moments are only lonely for those who are observing them. Perhaps we see loneliness in others simply to feel less lonely ourselves.
Kristen, thank you. That image of your father floating through space and hearing you read at the same time, I had goosebumps looking at it.
Oh, that's so sweet.
So you note at the beginning of the book that you started working on this in 2016, which I feel like was sort of fraught with its own upheaval and strangeness. And then 2020 happened. And as you sort of said, I mean, we've all been in this kind of extended isolation in greater or lesser degrees. And I wonder if you think that, I don't know if I would call it a benefit of the pandemic, but I wonder if you think that the pandemic has allowed us to speak more openly about loneliness. You note also too that like it's something that people tend not to talk to. Do you think that that conversation has been more possible now?
Yes, absolutely. My question, I mean, I think that when I started writing about loneliness, people didn't talk about loneliness. Like loneliness was like a personal failing or a personal flaw in some way. And it felt like you were like you'd done something wrong or like you had a bad personality or something. And which is stupid. That's completely not true. Like loneliness is a very complicated thing. Loneliness has nothing to do with the relationships you have or whether you have a very active social life or anything like that. Like solitude and loneliness are very different things, which is something I learned through the research. But I guess my question I have for the pandemic is the loneliness of the pandemic is very different from the problems of chronic loneliness that I was sort of investigating in this book. And I think we did start talking about loneliness a lot during the pandemic, but isolation was imposed on all of us during the pandemic. So I guess what I'm wondering now is what will the way that we speak about this look like when the emergency has passed? And I don't really know. I mean, what do you think?
I mean, I guess like one of the things that struck me most that I found like an actual revelation in the book was this idea of loneliness being almost biological, that there's that like hunger is a signal to eat and thirst is a signal to drink, that loneliness is a signal to connect.
Yeah.
Which I was just like, I mean, that was like mind blowing for me. Like, it was just like, and I think it like, it almost like, it sort of erased the stigma almost immediately. It was like, oh, this is a body's way of saying like, you here's a need that you have, you know? I mean, and I guess like, I don't know, it's funny, I guess in thinking about the pandemic, well, I guess actually, firstly, I want to ask, like, was that idea of the sort of biological basis of loneliness, was that like, did you know that? Like, is that something everyone knows, or did that? Okay.
I didn't know anything about loneliness other than the fact that I was lonely a lot. You know, I started drawing loneliness in 2016. As you mentioned, 2016 was a really weird year. I think it was a lonely year for a lot of people. I've always tried to find stats on whether or not election years are lonelier than others. And that's not research that anyone has done, but I think if it were done, it would be quite stark, particularly in countries like America, because it causes you to kind of feel confused about the world that you thought was real. It's jarring. It's kind of like a sort of like a writ large feeling of like, if you sit down with your partner or your good friend or something and you are like, this is my favorite movie, you're going to love it so much. And they're like, this movie sucks. And it feels it's a horrible, lonely feeling. And I think politics can sometimes feel like that, times a million. It can cause you to kind of like lose sense of what you thought was real. And so I think I was going through that. I was also going through a transitionary phase. Transitions are often very difficult and very lonely for a lot of people. Like when you move to a new place, you go through a breakup, you have a new job, something like that. Those things can be because you have to kind of recalibrate your whole life. And so I was kind of in that place. And then I thought I would just I started drawing people who were alone in public settings. And I was like, this is like a fun experiment. And I thought that would be it. But then I started kind of asking, what is loneliness? Why are we feeling it? What does it mean? I started to be curious about the way that we talked about loneliness or didn't talk about loneliness. And I think what really started it for me was that I started talking about, I'm thinking about a project about loneliness. And then I would be, I'd be sitting with someone like you over dinner, a friend who maybe we didn't ever talk about loneliness because who does? And then someone would be like, let me tell you about the loneliness I've ever felt. Like almost without ambiguity, someone would be like, I have a story of when I felt at my lowest. And I was just very struck by that, about how like visceral it was for people. And so then from there, I just started researching, I think.
Yeah. And that's one of the most striking moments in the book I found too, was this sort of, there's this kind of play over pages of people talking about their loneliest moments. And it's almost as though like recalling a car crash, like it's the specificity of it and the sort of the pain involved. And that, I don't know, that to me, that was again, like you said, bodily, this visceral experience. And what's interesting to me too, is that you balance this kind of this emotionality. And I found this with your first book as well. There's this balance of this sort of real emotion with a lot of history and a lot of research. And one of the figures that you talk about is this guy, Harry Harlow. Am I getting that name right? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, Harry Harlow, who did some like super grim monkeys. And I hadn't heard about him. I learned about him only through your book. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about him. And also, I was like, your sort of takeaway about him was so generous. I mean, it was a really beautiful understanding of this man and his work. And I wonder, like, did that evolve for you as you researched? Was that something that you immediately came to, or was that sort of like over time thinking and working on this project?
That's a great question. Okay, so I knew about Harry Harlow only in the broadest of strokes, like in high school psychology. So basically his very famous study is, he called it the surrogate mother study, which he did with baby rhesus monkeys. So they were separated, these baby monkeys were separated from their mothers at birth. And they never had any contact with a real biological mother. And they were put in a cage with two inanimate fake mothers. One was made of wire and one was made of cloth, and only the wire mother dispensed milk. And the experiment was to either prove or disprove the idea at the time, which was that human babies only loved their mothers because they fed them. That was what everyone understood. Science used the word proximity instead of love. It was like and the sort of common understanding of child rearing at the time was like, don't cuddle your kids, it'll make them like soft and they won't develop into like fully formed strong adults. Like, so it was it was kind of a withholding moment in child rearing in American history. And the studies showed the exact opposite. Like the monkeys became extremely dependent on the soft cloth mother and completely rejected the wire mother, and would like go in there to drink really quickly, but then run back to the sort of the more comfortable place. And so he sort of, it was this huge breakthrough. It completely changed the way that we understood childbearing, or child rearing. But then he kind of became this sort of stereotypical, like something out of a horror movie, like mad scientist character. He became more and more depressed. He was, in his personal life, he was a pretty rotten person. He treated his wives terribly. He was very negligent to his children. He was not an ideal coworker. He was a pretty rough person. But he suffered a lot from some pretty serious and debilitating mental health problems. And as his mental health began to decline, he began kind of enacting the suffering he was feeling in animals. So he became obsessed with replicating depression and isolation and loneliness in monkeys. So he built something that he called the pit of despair. And his colleagues were like, we can't call it that. We can't publish this. And like, so he did all of these things. He had all these horrible names for what he did. And he would sometimes isolate monkeys for years at a time. And, as we know, monkeys are very similar to human beings in the way that they feel pain and love and empathy and all these things. And the monkeys became completely obliterated. It was impossible for them to interact with the other monkeys once they rejoined the colonies. Like the monkeys would faint when they were touched because they were so overwhelmed, or they would starve themselves to death, or sometimes actually kill themselves. I mean, it was really horrific. And he was just never really satisfied with those studies, and he kept getting darker and darker and darker. And I just became completely obsessed with him. Like I read everything I could read about him. I read everything that he published. And the more I read, the more I was pretty confident that he, did a lot of really evil things. But I thought it was interesting to consider that perhaps he was like searching for meaning or love, or he was trying to see his pain reflected in a person or in a person-like animal in order to understand it. And so I tried to approach it from a form of empathy, but I do think he was not only a misogynist, but a pretty bad guy. Yeah. But he did these, he found, he did this, he completely changed the way that we raise children. I mean, he like absolutely essential contributions to science. So he was a very complicated person.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, you express it so beautifully, I mean, it really is, it's incredible. The empathy, I think that's it. That's exactly it. I mean, sort of portraying this man as like, wow. I mean, it's like shocking how sort of distressing, even just sort of thinking about these experiments and the sort of enacting his own pain and sort of thinking about it is like, okay, like he taught us a little bit about love, in this backwards way. I mean, this is kind of a process question as sort of, I mean, and maybe will show my ignorance towards the sort of graphic long form. I'm struck both in both of your books, like you are able to express so much in so few words. And I guess when you're approaching a long form project like this, does it start with an image? Does it start with language? Does it start with the two in combination?
I'd say it usually starts with language. I'm usually writing first, but I find that the project is always better when I move back and forth between text and image. Like if I were just to write a whole script and then draw it after, I think it would be a pretty unsuccessful project, just because for me, and I know a lot of artists work that way and it's very beautiful, but it's just like not how my brain works, because once I start to draw, it like opens things up, or it changes my relationship to the text, like I realize I drew that, I don't need to say it anymore, or I drew this and that reminded me of this other thing, and I want to talk through it write through it in this other certain way. So I do move back and forth a lot. But I think it starts with text. I might write, a couple of pages and then try to figure out how they fit on the page. I might start laying them out and start drawing. But I try not to do too much drawing at the beginning, other than like sort of like feeling drawings to get the feel for how something might look or how something might be structured, because it's just like, it's kind of like you make the project twice right off the bat. And then for me, the project changes like a million different ways as I go. The project that I end up with is a thousand miles away from where I started. So if I draw a whole book to begin with, I just have to, inevitably I'm going to throw it away and start again. So I try not to have to do that too much, just for the sake of my hand.
Mm-hmm. And is it a lot of, I don't know, I'm imagining sort of writing, and then, I mean, pairing. Is that, or do you think in these sort of, these really distilled chunks?
I definitely cut a lot out. a lot out. Like in the graphic novel I'm working on now, which is a absolutely catastrophic mess. But I probably wrote and drew like 500 plus pages and then threw out at least 300 of them, probably more. And that's just because I'm struggling with this project in a way I didn't. Like CQ just made sense to me, which isn't to say that there wasn't a lot of horrible stuff that I cut, or probably stuff that in a year I'm going to really wish I had cut, because that's just what happens, I think, with any writer as you grow. But CQ just like kind of like, it sounds stupid to say it like came out of me, but it kind of did. Like I was just like, it was all I was thinking about. And it felt kind of like things I'd been thinking about for so long. But I do cut a lot. But I think that as we all use the tools that we have, and I one of the ways I communicate is through image. And so I do write less than I used to. When I was like in grad school or something like that, and I were writing long form essays, I could churn out a lot more text than I can now. It's like, that's a skill that has changed now into, it's like gone away. And I write, I'm like, someone gives me assignment for 1,000 words. I'm like, that's not possible. I cannot possibly write 1,000 words,
Yeah. And that doesn't sound dumb at all to say that it came out of you. Like, I don't think that sounds dumb at all. And I think that you can sort of, there's something in the experience of reading and looking at the book that you can feel that, like the reader can feel that, there's something like this was very alive in you, which I think is, I don't know, I mean, deepens the reading experience, I think.
Do you cut a lot out as you work? Like, do you write long?
I write slow. And so it's usually not cutting. It's usually sort of going paragraph by paragraph, super slowly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, I think having worked towards word counts for so long, it's sort of like knowing what 1,500 words looks and feels like.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sort of what I can get across or try to get across in that amount of space.
Yeah.
I think like, I don't know, revising is, I don't know, I think like I'm getting to be a better at editing, which I used to not do really at all. And I'm sort of like finding the pleasure in that process.
It is pleasurable, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's better than writing, because writing is the worst for me anyway. Like writing something is just like agonizing. I mean, there's nothing worse than having nothing to me. I mean, like starting at the beginning of something is just like terrifying. So I think for me, having something to revise is such a relief, even if it's bad.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's interesting too. I mean, the idea of like that terror of having nothing, but then that's something just like coming and coming, which it sounds like that was, that like, and then the pain when that is not the case,
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things, writing is a solitary pursuit. And you talk about some of the motivation for working on this project was to, you yourself experience loneliness in more and less acute ways over time. And that this was sort of a way to have it be an antidote in some ways, or figure out how to, manage it when you inevitably feel it. I guess I'm curious about the experience both of writing the book, whether it did help in kind of navigating it or managing it, or sort of feeling like you can manage it in the future, and also the experience of the book coming out, which I think can be its own complicated feeling of both connection and isolation.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great way to say it. I mean, I will say that writing a book about loneliness did make me less lonely. Like I felt less lonely by the time I was done with it, because I understood it. And I think it's exactly what you said at the beginning, where you're like, oh, I'm hungry, I need to eat. I'm thirsty, I need to drink some water. I'm lonely, I need to do something about this. So when I understood it as something that's like not, it is emotional, it is an emotion, but it's also just something, it's the same way that we feel pain. Like if I put my hand down on something and it hurts, I'm like, oh, maybe I'm burning myself, or I have my hand on something that's sharp. And if I didn't feel that, I would continue to be harmed. And it's the same thing with loneliness. Like if we don't feel that impulse that draws us towards another person, we continue to be isolated, which is a really dangerous place to be emotionally, sometimes physically. And so yeah, it did make me feel much less lonely. I felt, and it feels like a hopeful project to me. I felt some hope at the end of the book about our ability to come together, I think. But yeah, putting out a book is just bizarre. I mean, it's just the weirdest feeling. I think I had a much harder time of it, my first book, because my first book felt like my identity or something, and like now it's just like I'm a writer, I write books, I draw books, but I'm still like a person. I'm still a person that just makes these things and does these things. It doesn't have to like define me in the same way, which also sounds kind of silly. Although I do feel like CQ is like, it feels like a big part of, again, I'm just going to just keep using all these cheesy metaphors, but it is like a big part of my heart, honestly. Like it feels like a very vulnerable, true part of who I am, but that feels less scary than it used to feel. It definitely feels less scary, but putting out a book is just like, it's such a trip. Like, it's just so strange.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And I like what you say. I mean, you mentioned it being hopeful, and I think that's definitely true. I think that, there's parts that are so, I feel like it's almost frightening, I think, reading about these, the statistics that you talk about, sort of people who experience deep loneliness are essentially primed towards death in a much more severe way. And that is frightening to read, and I think that even if you're someone who, like, if it's like, a day of just like, oh, like I feel alone, it's just like that can easily come in and be like, oh no, I'm gonna die, I'm gonna get cancer. But I think like it's balanced. Those moments of like the sort of severity of it are balanced with these moments of hope. There was a like the tiny line about how belly laughter is the closest noise that we make to animal noises, which like I just love. Like there was something like so pure and joyful about that. And I think, I don't know, I mean, maybe that sort of goes back to what we were saying at the beginning about like how is the pandemic, how could the pandemic potentially kind of help us, I don't know, navigate this, think about it in different ways. I think, I don't know, I feel like I have been experiencing, and talking to a lot of other people, experiencing the feeling of like when people are together now, it's like this, it isn't like thrown away, it's just like, wow, this is fantastic. This is so great. And not taking it for granted.
I feel that way. I mean, I wonder how that will last. I mean, I just feel like I have no idea what life will look like in a year. I just don't have any clue. I mean, I know that none of us do, but I think there was a kind of of course there was all this like dispute about how we handle the pandemic and masks and whatever. And like, that was this whole mess of like different varying opinions and different factions that formed, just the way that everything, we always kind of face that in America. But I think that there was also a kind of solidarity in the pandemic that made it, for me, like it was a horrible isolating time, but it wasn't the loneliest I've ever felt, because it felt very situational, and it felt in service of something. And then I watched just, like so many of us became really engaged in mutual aid and different volunteering. And that, like, to see communities mobilize was really incredible. And I just, that's the kind of stuff we should be doing all the time, every day, whether there's an emergency or not. And that's something I think we've really lost. And I think that's one of the reasons that loneliness is so out of control in America, is that we've fallen away from a lot of that community building that is so foundational to us being healthy, well-adjusted people.
Yeah, and it makes me think of one thing that this is not in the book, but I know from knowing you, is that you give away plants. And there's something so beautiful even thinking about that for me. Like it's just like, oh, calming and lovely to think about. And sort of feels like one of those immediate kind of like balms and antidotes to loneliness. And I wonder.
Well, it's such a simple thing. I mean, it's a great example of like the pandemic. I was just like in my house. I started growing seedlings on my windowsill for my backyard, and then I had extras and I put them outside with a sign that said free, and then they were gone in an hour, and then I just kept making more and more and more, and then I met my neighbors that way, in a way I hadn't before. And I live in Brooklyn. It's very common, of course, that we don't know our neighbors in a city or even in the suburbs or even in small towns. And it was just a really simple, kind of pure way to interact with other people. And it was quite calming. And in the pandemic, it was a safe way to be around each other because we were all outside. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of thing, like, why wasn't I doing that before? Like, I've always loved plants. Like, it never occurred to me until we sort of had this thing imposed upon us. So for myself, I hope that I learn from this time to just do stuff like that more often, and to engage with others more often, even people that I don't know. And I hope that will become a larger part of our attitude. But I think if we look throughout history, we haven't been the best learners. So we'll see.
You talk, and this will be maybe my last question, then we can move over to some audience questions. You talk about as being a kid and sort of going up to your bedroom and listening to Casey Kasem doing the top 40 and the letters that people would write, like, this is dedicated to my long lost sister. And I don't know, I was thinking about it, and in some ways, like, there's something about the pop song that I think like is I don't know why, like, particularly well equipped to loneliness. And I wonder, do you have favorite songs, poems, visual arts, movies that like are the best at capturing loneliness in your mind?
Definitely. That's a great question. I made for the blog Large Hearted Boy, I made a playlist of lonely songs. I think I probably put a Backstreet Boys song there to be funny, but also why not? But I think there's a couple of quotes about loneliness that I think about a lot. So Maggie Nelson called loneliness, she said, loneliness is solitude with a problem, which is just such a pure, simple way to explain loneliness. And then Emily Dickinson called loneliness the horror not to be surveyed, which I also think is very wonderful. So I think about those a lot. I think when I'm thinking about great representations of loneliness, but I also think that kind of every book is in some way about loneliness, because I think that we're all lonely all the time, like whether we articulate it to ourselves or not in small ways. Like no one is completely fulfilled all the time. Mm-hmm. So I think when you start looking for it, it's kind of everywhere.
Yeah. That sort of cosmic aloneness.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, let's see. I mean, I think a bunch of questions have rolled in. Benjamin's back.
Okay, and I am back to ask them. Yes, quite a few questions, lots of great ones. Okay, where shall I start? So we have a really interesting question. I'm going to start with the one that actually just came in. So Sharon Steele in the audience, this is a question for both of you. The loneliness of women in particular is a fraught theme in pop culture. Sometimes women are portrayed as lonely or in need of saving when they're really just free and solitary. Other times their pain or isolation is dismissed if it's somehow deemed not meaningful enough. Do either of you feel that women are less inclined to discuss their loneliness, even with one another, because of the way society passes judgment on lonely women? And what do you think could change that?
I have a lot of thoughts about this, Sharon. I'm glad you asked. So I write a lot about this in the book. I write about sort of like the romantic comedy notions of loneliness, and how I actually do it through Sandra Bullock, who, if you ever watch a Sandra Bullock movie, she's always lonely. Find me a movie where she's not lonely, because she's always lonely. And I've always been like waiting for a magazine to assign me a profile of Sandra Bullock so I can ask her if she's lonely, and that's why she does it. But there is this sort of like spunky, like late 20s, like I'm just bumbling around the city and I'm like waiting to be and I'm an orphan. She's always an orphan, and like or she like lives with her parents. It's one or the other. There's always something weird with her parents, and then her life is sort of saved when she finds a man. Like it's very simple. This formula is very simple. And then there's like the older Sandra Bullock, who's like great at her job and she takes it too seriously and she's not well liked. and she needs to be like softened in some way. But the way we portray loneliness on women on movies and television is completely different than how we depict men. And then we do it like kind of like a sexy sort of cowboy Don Draper kind of sensibility. But the stats on gender and loneliness are interesting because women are more inclined to continue to make friends throughout their life, and men tend to remain friends with people from childhood, and then those people begin to fall away. People move away, people get divorced, people die, people just fall out of touch, and men are less inclined to find replacements, whereas women are constantly finding new companions. So men actually have much higher rates of loneliness than women statistically. But I actually think that men are less inclined to discuss loneliness. That would be that's my feeling on it. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but I do feel like women are more likely to be labeled like pathetic if they talk about loneliness in a way that men are not. And I don't know how to change that. I wish I knew how to change that. Nina, do you have any thoughts?
I do, Kristen, in your book, I mean, it is striking, and I think you've spoken to it here now too. It is striking that the different ways that sort of men and women are portrayed, and even like the language around it, sort of like this sort of idea of the spinster versus the bachelor.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, like, yeah, I mean, sort of same, I'm at a loss a little bit of how to change it. Yeah, I don't know. There's a sort of, I guess it's like, I don't know, maybe it comes from having that understanding, and sort of that it's like, Kristen, you talk a bit about the differences, like you can be alone and not suffer loneliness.
Exactly.
And I guess that's one of the things that I find really interesting. Like some people are more able to tolerate or even thrive in solitude. And sort of, I mean, I guess it maybe comes from like an interior sort of experience of it and reframing it for your own individual self. I don't know. It's a good,
but it's actually a biological thing. I mean, so that's I think what made me not feel bad anymore about ever feeling lonely is it's like, it's totally outside of your control, whether you feel lonely or not. Like everyone has a different biological threshold that's programmed into their DNA, literally, about how much social contact they need. It's kind of introvert, extrovert kind of stuff. Although you can be an introvert and of course be very lonely, and you can be extrovert and be very lonely, or be not lonely at all. But we all need a different kind of amount of contact, and we all have like a different desire for specific kinds of contact. So someone could feel very fulfilled having like an extremely casual conversation about the rose bushes with their neighbors, and that could be all they need. And someone else needs to like talk about, the meaning of life or whatever, and that's what they need. So I think that is, earlier you asked about like coming to terms with loneliness, and I think that's really what made me feel fine about it when I felt it. It was just like, this actually has nothing to do with like mistakes I've made or choices I've made. It's just like my body telling me I need something.
So we have, jumping to the beginning of our questions, we got this question with someone who's inquiring about some of the stories you might have encountered making this book. Was there someone who stuck out to you as the loneliest person, or whose loneliness seemed, to at least to them or to you, sort of significant?
No, but I think that when I was reading like about the science of loneliness and how we become less maybe open to, one of the problems with chronic loneliness is that when the longer we stay in a state of loneliness, the more our body builds up the stress hormone that makes us unlikely to forge new relationships, because we are more likely to interpret strangers as threatening. And we interpret rejection even when rejection isn't there. It's called hypervigilance. And I started to recognize that in people that I know who I love very much, but who have just really failed to, or been unable to make connection for a long time. And I started to recognize some of those patterns. And so like things I'd been kind of like frustrated or annoyed about, like, what's the big deal? Just, head to the supper club and, hang out or whatever, like, join some new group or whatever. And I couldn't understand why someone felt resistant to that. And it makes more sense to me now when I understand the forces that are really working against that once we enter an isolated state.
And speaking of sort of the you talked a little bit at the beginning about sort of people's responses, you know, the person sort of jumping in, talking about their lonely state. And someone has an interesting question about, do you think loneliness, the honest conversation about it between friends, between acquaintances, even people who read your book, can it be its own way to connect?
1,000,000,000% yes. Resounding yes.
Yeah, great.
And I want to jump in there for a second.
Okay.
Like, I think it's amazing. I think, I don't know, thinking a lot about sort of solitude, loneliness, isolation, connection. I mean, it really, I think that the conversations that I think this book could provoke, and the experience even of just reading it, like absorbing it, is like, yeah, total. Again, not necessarily like, oh, now loneliness is solved, but it does. It's like, it's this antidote. It's this way of sort of rethinking and kind of re-understanding it. Yeah.
Nice thing to say.
Yeah.
Shifted this question from an attendee, so who begins, NPR mentions the work of Edward Hopper in the very nice review of this book, which really resonated with my experience looking at your art. Were there artists you turned to when drawing this book?
Definitely. I do love the work of Edward Hopper, although he was not a very nice person. He was very mean to his wife. So I like his work a little less, but it is very beautiful. I thought a lot about Yayoi Kusama in this book. I wrote about her a fair amount, and I wrote about a photographer a lot too. His name is Philip Lorca de Corsia, and he made this photography series called Heads, where he photographed people who didn't know they were being watched just on the street, and they're so like beautiful and painful and lonely looking. And I just looked at those. I spent a great deal of time looking at those. But I think art obviously impacts me a great deal. And I also just like thinking about the lives of the artists and kind of like how they were brought to a specific subject. So I did a lot of that during this book.
So the next question is one that I'm going to sort of pick apart because I think it's sort of interesting and asks a lot of different things. But
right.
The attendee begins with, the pandemic has not changed my life profoundly, and yet I have friends who have said this, that has been a profound shift. I feel lonely because I don't feel the same way. And I'm sort of interested that, because sometimes loneliness is this person you're trying to connect with is on a very different kind of plane that you are, and is reacting to a situation in a way that's different than you. And I was wondering if the book kind of talks about that at all, sort of the ways that loneliness is just because of people unable to connect.
Yeah, I don't address that specifically, but I think that instance is very interesting. I had a friend who said the same thing. She was living with a roommate in New York throughout the whole pandemic, and she felt a lot of pain throughout the pandemic because her roommate, her closest person, her only person sometimes that she saw, had a completely different experience, and her friend was able to tolerate it much more than she was, and she felt like there was something wrong with her because she couldn't, and it did to kind of strain their relationship in ways that she wasn't really able to talk about with her. And I thought that was just like such a beautiful, profound, sad, true thing when she talked to me about that. And I think one of the things in our relationships, I think in order for them to succeed, is we have to understand that our experience of reality is different than someone else's experience of reality, and that they're never going to line up, and that's okay. It's kind of like the example I gave about like, I'm sitting down with Nina and I'm like, Nina, I can't wait for you to see this movie. And she's like, this movie sucks. And it doesn't mean that like Nina and I can't still be close and experience the world together, but that our interpretation of it is going to be different. But that can be a very painful thing to recognize. It's kind of like, how do I know that the green I see is the same color, the same green that you see? You know, I mean, it's like, you know, it kind of like, it can cause you to wonder if what you're observing is real. But I think that's also wonderful that we experience things differently. And that's, I think, where like empathy comes in.
That's actually, like this idea of shaking up this idea of how we understand what's real. That's such an isolating experience. It's like, is my experience, is this a valid experience? And you talk again, like right at the start of the book, there's this, I mean, in the part that you read, this acknowledgement, you know, like, do I exist? You know, and I feel like those things are the same in some ways. Like, wow, is my reality real? Like, do I exist? Which I think can be like, those are frightening questions.
Yeah, totally. It's super scary.
So we have one more question. And I'm going to ask both of you this because we have someone asking a writing question. So Beatrice in the audience says, I love both of you and was wondering if you could share some advice about writing and how do you let go of a book that you have? Either, and I think let go meaning like once it's finished and you need to just sort of send it off, or have you ever written something and then you kind of have to just let it go because it's not working?
Yeah. Yes. So I think that there are two things. So if I can interpret the question, I'm not completely clear on what stage you're at in the project. So I would say if you're at the stage where you're like, I really want to write this project, I can't let it go, and you haven't written it, you should 100% write it. And just, I think you have to write what you're driven to write. I'd be really curious to hear Nina respond to this, but I think it's so hard to make work that don't stop yourself from writing the thing you want to write. If you feel like there's something else you should write or something else you should be doing, you just have to write what feels right to you. And then when it's time to let it go, that's a really hard question. Nina, I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, to sort of piggyback on what you were saying just now, the idea of, I don't know, there's a voice that sort of says, that kind of keeps clawing if the project needs to come out, that it's like, it won't let you go. And the way I think about it is that it's usually the stuff that I feel most fearful about. It's sort of like, okay, yeah, like there's sort of this impulse to be like, no, like stay away. Yeah. But like, it's like, no, actually that's exactly where you should aim your attention.
Or you're like embarrassed or something. I feel like that embarrassment has a lot to do with it.
Totally. And sort of being like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to tell this story. And I think like that, those sorts of fears now sort of signal to me, like that's the right direction to go in terms of letting something go and sort of saying like, this isn't going to work. I mean, I definitely have a bunch of aborted projects, where it's just like putting a ton of time into something. And then, I don't know, just sort of saying like, all right, this isn't going to be the big complete thing. And I think the way I think about that is that like, from those projects, there are always things I can pull from,
exactly.
Like they're like, all right, that might not be the whole thing, but like in other things that I work on, like I will be able to pull from that, whatever thinking or writing or whatever. It's so like, they don't feel like, oh, I've just wasted 6 months or a year or whatever. It's like, I've just got this pile, this kind of reserve is the way I think about it.
I think sometimes for me too, I've realized that like I was circling around an idea that I hadn't figured out yet. And that the idea is like, I was like circling like this, and that the idea is actually like on this side and all this other stuff can go, but like this part actually has to become like this. Yeah. And like, that's really the center of it. Like, I think sometimes I'm writing about an idea for a long time before I understand what it is, which means I write in the wrong direction a lot. But it's like the work that has to get done before you can write like it's never really wasted time. Yeah. Like even if you're writing a year into a project that then completely pivots or that you throw away, it's like you had to get through that work to get to the stage you needed to get to either way. So I don't think there's any sense in really like beating oneself up over that.
Yeah, as painful as it is, I completely agree. I completely agree. Yeah.
So that is all the questions we have from the audience. I also do think that's ending on a hopeful and a keep on plodding along, keep on working is a great note to end. Are there any final thoughts from either of you?
Just thank you so much.
Grateful to Kristen. I urge everyone to get this book. It really is. It's phenomenal.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you so much for sharing this hour with me. It was so wonderful. And if you already have my book or you don't want my book, please, either way, make sure you pick up Nina's book. And if you already have both of our books, please buy a different book from Harvard Bookstore to say thank you for the event tonight, because this takes a lot of work to put on. So please show your appreciation.
Thank you so much for that note. I have put the link to purchase tonight's book in the chat a couple times. It'll bring us to our website where you can find lots of other good books if you want to keep shopping. Thank you once again to Kristen and Nina for this fantastic conversation. Thanks to all of you out there for spending part of your evening with us. Please learn more about this incredible book and purchase CQ at harvard.com. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, enjoy the rest of your week. Keep reading, stay safe, and stay dry and stay cool, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank
Enjoy.
you.